Good evening, everyone. We are now at the final chapter of the book of Jeremiah, where we're studying in chapter 52. In the closing of this book, we come one full circle to recognize the event, and this is historical, as Jeremiah captures this event at the very end of the reign of Zedekiah. And so it begins this. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king. I think this is something that we can understand. There was Josiah, and then we have Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, and then we have a short period of Jehoiakim, and that is a king, right? And then a long period where we have Zedekiah. So we have 3 months, 11 years, and 11 years. And we are here at Jeremiah 52. And so what we have here is at the time of Josiah, Zedekiah was a very young child. When he was 21 years old, right here, he became king. And he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. That's the 11 years here. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of uh, Yirmiyahu of Livna. Now, what was important about the mother's name is this. According to the traditions, the father of Zedekiah was Josiah. The mother was Hamutal. Hamutal raised Zedekiah in the sense that, as we are told here, that he grew up listening to only the mother's advice. That would be the purpose of it being written here. Josiah had already died. And so we have the mother, Hamutal. And because he was so used to listening to his mother's advice, Zedekiah grew up not listening to another man's advice, particularly Jeremiah. And that's how the Jews had understood this particular episode. Then we find that Zedekiah, and this is the he, also did evil. And I want us to pay attention to this in the sight of the Lord. Now, this idea in the sight of the Lord is in the eyes of the Lord. And so, good and evil is always seen from the eyes of the beholder. Now, allow me to reiterate this concept. First of all, evil must be seen. And so it can be seen from the eyes of the beholder, in this case, Jehovah. And the reason why it can be seen is because it was done. You will always find that evil, in this case, Ra, and Tov would be good. So good and evil is always seen from the eyes of the beholder. It can be seen because it is done. It's not because it's in the mind. God is never set to see evil in the mind and to judge that. And so when evil is in the mind, the person who is thinking evil has a choice to not do it. And so that would not be a problem. And that would be a choice that he has to make. But when it is written this way that he did, which means that he actually made a choice to do what is wrong and what is not acceptable in the eyes of the beholder, and that would be God, Jehovah. And that is the judgment here, that the actions is deemed to be evil. And then it says here, according to all that Jehoiakim has done. And that would be the brother. And so Josiah was a good king. Jehoiakim didn't. And then Jehoiakim was taken into Babylon. Now we have Zedekiah. And then we are told Zedekiah and Jehoiakim are both having done evil in the sight of the Lord, or in the eyes of the Lord, that Jehovah looked at what they did and had proclaimed it to be evil, that is not functional, not according to what God had expected them to behave. Now we continue to see this. For in verse 3, that would be, for this reason, for because uh, is actually one word in the Hebrew. For this reason, the anger of the Lord happened in Jerusalem and Judah. And we need to understand that the response of God after all these years is finally shown till he, Jehovah, finally casts them out from his presence. Now, this idea of cast them out of his presence is about a rejection of them as king. We then also see this. Then Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. You see, Zedekiah had followed and subjected himself to the king of Babylon in his early days. And then towards the latter part of his reign, he decided not to pay tribute to the king of Babylon, and then he went to seek refuge from the king of Egypt. And that was the time when Nebuchadnezzar decided to take action. In verse 4, now it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month. Now, please bear in mind that before the time of the Babylon exile, the way that the Bible describes month of year is always by a number. So it was the 9th year of his reign in the 10th month. And so the 10th month after they come back from Babylon has a name. Then on the 10th day of that same month, and so the calendar of the Jewish people has always been tracked by the number of year and the number of month and the number of the day of the month, because there were no names assigned until they were in exile in Babylon, and they adopted the Babylonian names. Now, when it came to this part in the 9th year of his reign, just bear in mind, on the 11th year, that would be the end. And here in the 9th year, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and all his army came against Jerusalem, took siege against it, built a siege wall against it all around. And this is about Jerusalem. That's a final frontier. And so the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So we see this from the 9th to the 11th year, there was a siege. And at the end of the 11th year, the siege was broken and they broke the wall. Now we are given a number of dates. By the fourth month, on the ninth day of the month of the 11th year. And this is what we are talking about. So as we read text like that, I think it will be useful for us to bear in mind that it is trying to tell us a sense of timing. On the fourth month, on the ninth day of that same month, the famine had become so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land inside the city of Jerusalem. Verse 7, we have then. This word is and then. We find that this narrative starts on the fourth month in the ninth day of the month, and by tradition, the and then would be the 17th day of the month. The city wall was broken through, and all the men of war fled and went out of the city at night by way of the gate between the two walls, which was by the king's garden, even though the Chaldeans were near the city all around, and they went by the way of the plain. So, what we're told here is that by the ninth day, the famine was really bad. And by the 17th day, now how do we know the 17th day? And this would be by tradition. By the 17th day, they actually have a fast proclaimed uh, at the time of the exile to commemorate the city wall being breached. In verse 8, but the army of the Chaldeans, but here would be and then. So we are now told of a narrative as they try to escape. The army of the Chaldeans pursued Zedekiah the king, overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho. So what we can see from a map would be this. We have the Sea of Galilee, and then we have the Jordan, and then we have the Dead Sea. By this, we find that we have Jerusalem, and then we have them trailing down to the plains of Jericho. Now, it's a plain because this area here is a flat land, all both sides. Now we continue on. All his army was scattered from him, the army of Zedekiah. So they took the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riflah. Now in verse 9, Riflah is a place further up north. The reason being there is because Nebuchadnezzar did not come to Jerusalem. He sent his army instead. In the land of Hamath, most likely in Syria, and he pronounced judgment on him. Verse 10. Remember, all of this has to do with the prophecy that was stated against Zedekiah. Verse 10. And then the king of Babylon killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, meaning it was to his eyes. So that Zedekiah was looking at this, he witnessed the death of his sons. And then we find another word here. And he killed all the princes of Judah in Riflah. So the sons were killed, the princes of Judah were killed. He also put out the eyes of Zedekiah. Now, this idea of put out the eyes of Zedekiah is, I guess you can say, blinded. He blinded Zedekiah, and tradition has it that his eyes were pierced. to cause to be blind. And it appears that the death of his sons were some of the final visions he would have in his eyes. And the king of Babylon bound him in bronze fetters, took him to Babylon, and put him in prison till the day of his death. Now, it means that he was placed in prison, but he didn't die in prison. Right? He didn't die in prison in the sense that uh, at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, uh, Zedekiah didn't die. Zedekiah died after the king of Babylon died. Verse 12. Now, in verse 12, we're told, now in the 5th month, on the 10th day of the month, we had this, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, and this would be his executioner. We read of him earlier with regards to Jeremiah, who served the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. Now, in this period of time, we find that on the 5th month, this would be the month of Av, by the way, in the 10th of the month, he burned the house of the Lord and the king's house, all the houses of Jerusalem, that is, all the houses of the great, he burnt with fire. So this is equivalent to the month of Av. This is the 10th day. And what really did happen was the fire was started on the 9th, and it burned through the 10th, where it completely razed it to the ground. That's how it would be seen. And so the idea of the completion of the burning was recorded here on the 10th day, but the starting of the fire was on the 9th day. All the army of the Chaldeans who were with the executioner broke down all the walls of Jerusalem all around. And then in verse 15, and then Nebuzaradan, the executioner, carried away captive some of the poor people. Now, in verse 15 and 16, these were the what we call the defectors, as well as the remnant, the rest of the people who remained in the city, the defectors who had deserted to the king of Babylon, and the rest of the craftsmen who were now aligned to Babylon, saved their lives. When Nebuzaradan, the executioner, left some of the poor of the land as vine dressers and farmers. The entire land was left in shambles. He left some people to take care of the land. He also took the rest of them. And so this is a record of the historical event. In verse 17, it records how they treated the temple. In verse 17, it says the copper pillars that was in the temple, and the carts uh, of the bronze basin that were in the temple. The Chaldeans broke into pieces, carried all their copper to Babylon. They also took away the pots, the shovels, the trimmers, the bowls, the spoons. All these are utensils of the temple, and all the bronze utensils or copper utensils which the priests were using in the temple. The basins, fire pans of the fire offering, the bowls, the pots, the lampstands, the menorah, the spoons, the cups, and whatever was solid gold and whatever was solid silver, the captain or the executioner took away. The two pillars, one basin, the sea, the 12 bronze bulls, the copper bulls, which were uh, designed to be the base, which were under it, the carts of the basins, which King Solomon had made. And this one you can see in uh, First Kings chapter 7, had made for the temple. The bronze or the copper of all these articles were incredibly well crafted. And now the pillars, the height of one pillar was 18 cubits, a measuring line of 12 cubits. These are all the measurements of the circumference around it. The thickness was 4 fingers. It was hollow. A capital of copper was on it, and the height of one capital was 5 cubits. You can just imagine this is a very tall pillar, and on top of it would be the capital. So the capital is a very popular way of building it. They were covered with a network of pomegranates all around the capital, all of copper. So if we spend some time to watch First Kings chapter 7, you find that there is a description of pomegranates all around, and this is a decoration called the capital. The capital is the top part of the pillar. The second pillar with pomegranates was the same, and so there were two pillars that were standing right in front of the temple. There were 96 pomegranates on the side. When you count all the pomegranates all around on the network, there were 100. So pomegranates is the shape of the decor that was on top of the pillar. In verse 24, there is a continuation. There is the and then that's missing, which is typical of most of the translations. And then the executioner took Sariah, the chief priest. And then we have Zephaniah, the second priest, and 3 doorkeepers. These were the people who were taking care of the temple. He also took out of the city an officer who had charge of the men of war. 7 men of the king's closest associates were found in the city. The principal scribe of the army who mustered the people of the land, and 60 men of the people of the land who were found to be in the middle of the city. These were the ones who knew the city and the temple. In verse 26, it says, and then Nebuzaradan, the executioner, took these and brought them to the king of Babylon in Rivlah. And then the king of Babylon struck them and put them to death at Rivlah in the land of Hamath. And thus Judah was carried away captive from his own land. Now, let me just pause here a little bit to explain. The severe destruction of Jerusalem and the temple was not expected of Babylon upon God's people. The prophecy was that they would be in siege, they would die of hunger, they would die by the sword, but the extent of the damage was way beyond what God had allowed. But Nebuchadnezzar, being Nebuchadnezzar, using his man Nebuzaradan, went to completely destroy everything in sight, as well as the temple. That was the vengeance that we read in the past 2 chapters, in chapters 50 and 51. What was allowed was the exile. Now, the exile is promised in the book of Leviticus. because if they refuse to listen to God, there would be no rain. And if they continue to refuse to God, they would not be able to have their harvest. But the finality of their disobedience and their rejection of God's authority would be that God will forcefully take them away from the land. God's land, God's rules. And God has been very patient. And for whatever they have done, the finality would be one, the northern kingdom taken away by Shalmaneser, and then by Sennacherib, and then the finality of Judah was done by Nebuchadnezzar. And so captivity or exile, taken away from the land, is promised by God if they do not repent. So the time that it took for Assyria and then Babylon to come to execute God's final judgment was to give them time to repent, which they didn't. And the king was also single handedly responsible for defiance. And so God gave him up to Nebuchadnezzar. These are the people whom Nebuchadnezzar carried away captive in the 7th year when he came to take the land, 3,023 Jews. Now, this is a count in verse 28. This count itself is a small number because there were more that were taken. In the 18th year, he carried away from Jerusalem 832 people. These were, there were supposed to be more. So you see 3,000, and then we have another 832 persons. And in the 23rd year, Nebuzaradan came to take away captive 745 persons. All the persons were 4,600. However, according to the tradition, we find that there were more than 10,000, another 7,000 of the tribe of Benjamin were also taken. So by 3,000 and then 7,000, we have approximately 10,000 of them who actually were removed from Babylon. So the idea here is that in the time of Nebuchadnezzar finally breaking the wall of Jerusalem, there were at least 10,000 people who were taken exile from Jerusalem. Now, apart from that, we have already seen that there were 3 sieges. In the first siege of Jehoiakim, we had the likes of Daniel and his friends who were part of the first wave that were taken. So what we are recording here in chapter 52 would be the final ones who were removed. And so each siege were taken over. The first siege, Daniel. The second siege, Ezekiel. And the third siege, the rest of them. We now come to the final few passages of the book of Jeremiah in chapter 52. The historical record now brings us back to the time of Babylon. It says here, now it would be, and then a period of time have come to pass that in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 25th day of that month. So now we're talking about a time of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, who was already taken into Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. And in his place, Zedekiah was put in place. That's 11 years when Zedekiah was then also captured and taken into Babylon. So now we see here, we have Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, and then it was 3 months, and then he was taken into Babylon, and then we have Zedekiah, 11 years. And then he was also taken into captivity. Now we are talking about the 37th year of the captivity, from here all the way down to the 37th year. This is about Jehoiakim into the 37th year. And why is this important? Because by the time of the 37th year, which we have about 26 years after, then Nebuchadnezzar had died. And we have a new king. His name is Evil Merodach. Evil Merodach, the king of Babylon, who is the son of Nebuchadnezzar. In the first year of his reign, he lifted up the head of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, and brought him out of prison. And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a more prominent seat than those of the kings who were with him in Babylon. And who was that? That would also be Zedekiah and all other kings. And so Jehoiakim changed from his prison garments, and he ate bread regularly before the king all the days of his life. Now, this doesn't mean that he was sitting at the table of the king, but he had a prominent place where the princes of Evel Merodach would have had their meal. And as for his provisions, there was a regular ration given him by the king of Babylon, a portion each day until the day of his death, all the days of his life. Tradition has it, again, I say tradition because we don't have it in the Bible, that after Nebuchadnezzar had died, and then Evil Merodach took over, we find that right upon this time, at the time of Nebuchadnezzar's death, then Zedekiah as well, and this is what we're told, right? Uh, Zedekiah as well as Jehoiakim uh, eventually died in the early days. Zedekiah died, and then eventually uh, Jehoiakim also died. And it would be in a time of Evil Merodach. And so we see that Zedekiah and Jehoiakim outlived Nebuchadnezzar because they were both much younger than Nebuchadnezzar. And upon the death, we have Zedekiah and then eventually Jehoiakim. Now, Jehoiakim we were told in Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 30, that he would not have any children, no descendants. And that would be the prophecy that was given in Jeremiah 22. But it appears that in the merit of his repentance during this time, that God had seen that he was forgiven and he did have a child. And he had a child, and then eventually he had a grandson. Uh, Shealtiel would be his son. And then he had a grandson that we would all know, and that would be Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel would be the one who went back to rebuild the temple eventually. So this would be how it has turned out. Now, we don't have the last part here, but we do have it in the book of Chronicles. Jehoiakim had a good life after Nebuchadnezzar died, had a son, had a grandson who is Zerubbabel, and then eventually going back into the final parts of the Hebrew Bible of the second temple rebuilding. Now, with this, we come to the end of our chapter today, as well as the end of the book